And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Dr. Howard Friedman with us. Howard, also tell us about the Longevity Project. The book came out in March, I believe, not too long ago. So
yes.
How's it doing?
Well, it's getting a lot of attention. We've been on a number of TV shows, and it's coming out in all kinds of international editions in German and Russian and Korean and Chinese and on and on and on. So there's a lot of attention because there's never been a study like this it's scientific, but the book was written for the average layperson to be able to understand it. And it does have little assessments and examples in the book so people can kind of figure out how they're doing. And, it's not 100%, but it gives you some good idea of whether you're heading on a more healthy trajectory and what changes you can make in your own life. But really, it's a presentation of 25 years of scientific research based on 8 decades of data collection.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, we've heard the old saying, stress kills. Is that true?
Well, that was really one of the most interesting things that we found, that stress, in the sense that people usually think about it, is not necessarily a problem. So you always hear, take it easy, don't work so hard. But we didn't find that at all. We found that the people who worked the hardest, they tended to live the longest. It was just really striking. So the ones who had success in their careers and even moved up more and more in their careers, they did better and better.
Deadlines, working on deadlines, things like pressure helped them.
Well, pressure if you could do it. So if you have a lot of deadlines, a lot of pressure, and you don't have the resources, and you have nasty coworkers, then that's not good. But if you kept increasing responsibility, like you said, you moved up. Your father was asking you when you're going to be in the news bureau, and when you're going to have your national radio show. That kind of move up is very healthy. You have more and more responsibility, but you have more and more resources, and you thrive. One of the people we studied was one of the participants who has been publicly identified as Edward Dmytryk. He was the highly successful director of the Caine Mutiny, starring Humphrey Bogart back in 1954, and he had anything but an unstressful life. He was the son of Ukrainian immigrants, and his family had moved to San Francisco and then Los Angeles, just in time for him to be noticed by his teacher. And he was recommended to Dr. Terman, and he was included in this study. And his mother died, and his father was not very nice to him, and he had to go to work as a teenager as a low-paid messenger at Paramount Pictures. And as he worked his way up in the film industry, he still had more and more stress. In 1947, his movie career just ground to a halt because he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was investigating communists and communist sympathizers in Hollywood. And he refused to testify, and he became one of the Hollywood 10. Those were the directors and producers who were cited for contempt of Congress and blacklisted. And he was sent to a federal prison camp. His wife divorced him. Okay, stress, right? So a few years later, he said, okay, I want to work again, and he decided to change his stance, and he said, I did have some communist sympathies in the 1930s, but, I'm going to testify anyway. I don't really support that anymore. And so then he was scorned by some in Hollywood on both sides who thought he shouldn't have been affiliated and then who thought that he shouldn't have testified. So he was both a sellout and an informer and a former communist, and so he had a lot of interpersonal stress, yet he went on to have a really spectacular career. In addition to the Caine Mutiny, he directed Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable and Elizabeth Taylor and Marlon Brando. So you might think, well, all that stress, is that bad for him? How long did he live? He lived almost the full 20th century. He died at age 90. So that really... Go
figure.
That really, we did. We said, well, how can that be? And that's really where we started looking into the stress. And it turns out that relax, avoid stress, don't work so hard. Those are really common advice, but they turn out to be really poor advice, even rotten advice. As I said, if the people like Dmytryk who, succeeded in their careers, moved up, and, the stress didn't hurt them. They were able to overcome it, and that made them healthier. So if you're facing a situation where you're challenged, you should be able to think about it in a healthy way and realize that it can make you actually stronger in the long run. So we kept finding that again and again. The people who overcame their challenges, they became more resilient and were able to face future challenges in their lives.
I wonder, for example, Howard, how many people die of a heart attack stuck in like L.A. traffic or something like that?
Well, that kind of frustration when you can't do anything about it, that is unhealthy. And anything that, gets your heart really beating too fast, whether it's shoveling snow or just, making yourself more and more crazy in a trapped situation, that's certainly unhealthy. But working hard, if you're heading towards, some great performance you're going to do in LA, or you're heading towards, some other job that you love, then it's probably not a problem.
Let's talk about exercise for a moment and how this fits into the equation as well. Generally, if you exercise, are you going to live longer? I have heard mixed things about that. I've heard stories of guys dying on the treadmill. What do you say?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories of that, and we looked into that in some detail, and it was really interesting what we found. First of all, let me say that there's many active people who don't like to just exercise for the sake of exercise. And my favorite quote was from the astronaut Neil Armstrong. He said, "I believe the good Lord gave us a finite number of heartbeats, and I'll be damned if I'm going to use mine running up and down a street." So Armstrong, he didn't mind the astronaut training. Was really rigorous, right? But there was no way anybody was going to make him, go on endless jogs. And that's kind of what we found, that people who were naturally active in their activities from day to day across their life, they tended to stay healthy. The people who said, well, I'm going to get out there and do a lot of exercise, well, they didn't. So if you're physically very active and you love going to the gym and you love, jogging or whatever, that's fine if you can do it. But most of us, to make the resolution, a few months later, the gym's empty. The shoes are put away. In the days of these tournament participants, there weren't a lot of gyms, and they weren't Nike company didn't exist, and there was no jogging shoes, and so how did they stay healthy? Well, they engaged in natural kinds of activities, and we looked at the children who were really active, like in college sports. And most of them, by the time they were middle age, they weren't so active anymore. And so, you know what? They didn't live very long. But the ones who had maintained some level of activity, maybe they always liked to go for walks, or maybe they liked woodworking, or maybe they liked even cooking, anything that got them up and out of their chair, that made a big difference. So when we looked at these trajectories from childhood through young adulthood, my doctoral student, Peggy Kern, did a lot of this great work. And we found really clearly if you could stay active into middle age, that was a really good sign. It kept you healthy, and it promoted long life. So I think we give too many oversimplified health recommendations. Get out there and do all this vigorous exercise. Most people aren't going to do that. If you think back even 50 years when John Kennedy became president, he almost immediately began emphasizing the importance of physical health.
Yes.
And he said, we want to do 50-mile hikes. And that same year, one of the tournament participants, Ansel Keys, was on the cover of Time magazine, and he told Americans, Americans, you eat too much. So now we're exactly 50 years later, right? So we had President Kennedy saying, get out there and do these hikes and do this, get in shape, and we had Ansel Keys saying, you eat too much. Well, that didn't have any good effect, right? So now people are more out of shape and more overweight than ever. So that's one of the important lessons of the Longevity Project. Don't just give people lists of advice. That doesn't work for most people. It's good to have the knowledge, but then you need to develop the patterns that you can maintain over many years that really make a huge difference in how healthy you stay.
The kids who came from two different kinds of families, broken homes, happy homes, what happened?
Well, that was really surprising and somewhat disappointing, and a lot of people have been picking up on this now that it's becoming getting a lot of attention. We found that the strongest social predictor in childhood of early mortality, that means who is most likely to die at a young age in terms of social aspects of their lives, was the children whose parents divorced when they were children. So it was a huge negative impact. and it wasn't anything that was just a function of the children. It was something about the conflict that they lived in. It led them to become poorer in their health habits. It led them to have poorer social relationships of their own, and then it really increased their risk for dying before their time. But there was good news there. There were some of the people whose parents divorced, some of the children, they were able to overcome it by the time they reached adulthood. They had established good relationships of their own, and they had accomplished things in their life. And if you had a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment, even though you had come from a rough childhood, and you were able to maintain good relationships, such as a good marriage yourself, then your risk dissipated. So there's bad news and there's good news. You know, the bad news, parental divorce, big risk factor, very bad for the children unless it was a really negative environment to begin with, and then a lot of times it was better to get out of that. But still, overall it was a negative. But many children were able to overcome it. But the ones who didn't, they engaged in unhealthy behavior, an unhealthy pattern after unhealthy pattern across the decades, and it took more than 5 years off their lives on average.
We're going to get some recommendations a little bit later on from you, Howard, just so we can kind of fine-tune the way we live in our lifestyle. What do you mean by catastrophic thinking? What's that?
Well, that's thinking that the world's going to come to an end when something small happens. So if an acorn drops on your head and you say, the sky is falling, then we call you a catastrophizer. So if you explain things, bad events, as doom is everywhere, rather than saying, well, it's an isolated event and I'll be able to overcome it, that's called catastrophizing. So we looked back when the determined participants were younger, and as part of the longevity project, and we looked at how they explained things that had happened to them. And so we could tell who were the catastrophizers and who were the ones who weren't. And then we used that to predict what happened to them, what they died from, and how long they lived. And the results were pretty clear. The catastrophizers tended to die at a younger age, especially the men. And this held true even if we excluded the ones who died immediately following these kinds of assessments. It wasn't just that they were already ill and that's why they thought everything was bad in their lives. So if you saw misfortunes as